Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
This morning, members of Temple Beth Shalom gathered alongside the Jewish Federation of Greater Miami, Catalyst Miami, and members of the Overtown community to celebrate Juneteenth in an event called Legends of the Diamond, a Juneteenth celebration at Dorsey Park. The event served to bring together the Black and Jewish communities to honor today's federal holiday, officially known as Juneteenth National Independence Day, the annual celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. While the holiday has been observed by many since 1866, it only became an official federal holiday in 2021. President Lincoln announced that the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect on January 1st, 1863, ending enslavement in the southern United States and the Confederacy. However, it wasn't until 900 days later, on June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Texas, the farthest state of the Confederacy, were finally freed, hence Juneteenth. For reference, enslaved people were freed in Florida on May 20th, 1865. And we know that even after the Emancipation Proclamation and the official abolition of slavery, slavery practices continued, segregation took hold, and it transformed into Jim Crow and other forms of oppression in the South. In just a few short weeks, we will celebrate the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the independence of this country. And yet, even after 250 years of the United States and 161 years since the end of slavery, it continues to be difficult for many to grapple with the very real and sordid beginnings of enslavement and oppression that so much of our country was built upon. The goal of today's celebration was threefold: gather differing communities to build relationships, honor the freedom of enslaved peoples and Black elders who paved the way for modern communities, and specifically, learn about the history of one of the oldest Black communities here in Miami, Overtown. Our event was held at Dorsey Park, named after Dana Dorsey, one of the first Black millionaires in the American South. Born to enslaved people, Dana was the first child born into freedom in his family in 1872 in Georgia. Dana, known by many as D.A., came to Miami as a carpenter in the 1890s. When he saw the need to house Black workers, he bought up parcels of land, eventually purchasing much of what is Overtown today. Today we learned that Dorsey owned other pieces of land across Miami, at one point even owning Fisher Island, but due to restrictive covenants, as a Black man, Dorsey was not allowed to live on much of the land that he owned. Dorsey donated the land for where Dorsey Park sits today, specifying to the city that it be made the first official park in the area that it was that time known as Colored Town. After World War I, Dorsey Park became the home of the Negro baseball leagues, and in 1939, they began playing night games under bright lights right there in Overtown. One of the most famous teams who played there was called the Ethiopian Clowns, who were made by their white team owner to dress as clowns and play baseball as minstrels. They were a precursor to the now famous Harlem Globetrotters, and families from across Miami, both Black and white, would come to Dorsey Park to watch the Negro baseball teams play. Today, I learned so much about the history of Overtown, the baseball leagues, and the cultural impact on our community. There was one detail that stopped me cold. There was a presentation by a man named Mr. Ivory, who is a historian of Overtown. He said that the Negro baseball leagues were the inventors and early adopters of shin guards and batting helmets in baseball, which are now staples of the sport. As the Negro leagues began to play against white teams, white players would often throw their bats at the heads of Black players or purposefully slide into the shins of Black players using their cleats, thus creating the need for heavy-duty protective gear. It's a painful irony that the very violence used to harm Black athletes ultimately made the sport safer for everyone. Innovation born from oppression. So why does all of this history matter? And what does it have to do with us, sitting in this synagogue, Temple Beth Shalom in Miami Beach? This morning, as the gathering began, we all went around in a circle, and we each shared our reason for being present and invoked the name of an ancestor who inspired us. There was one woman who shared that she was there to learn, and she invoked her ancestors who came to the U.S. as pilgrims. She said, "I hope I can learn and reconcile the history of the harm that my ancestors might have done." I've shared with many of you as well that as a Southern Jew, I too often struggle to reconcile my family's history with my own present. While generations of my family may not have been direct contributors to the systems that oppressed people of color, they benefited from those systems all the same. Some in my family going as far as to work against integration in the Atlanta school system. I don't say it to perform guilt. I say it because I believe naming it is the beginning of responsibility. It is, after all, part of my story. As Jews, a major piece of what we do involves remembering. We retell our stories year after year to etch them upon our hearts, and we use rituals and holidays to remember those who came before. But how does our tradition invite us to remember when our past isn't always pretty? I believe this week's Torah portion can illuminate a path forward, though ironically, sort of in reverse. Let me explain. This week, we read the famed story of Korach. As the Israelites traveled in the desert after they were cursed to wander for 40 years for a lack of faith in God, members of the community staged a rebellion against Moses and his leadership. Korach of the tribe of Levi and Dotan and Aviram of the tribe of Reuben rose up against Moses along with 250 leaders of the Israelites. They said to Moses, "You have gone too far. For all the community are holy, all of them, and God is in their midst. Why do you raise yourselves above God's congregation?" Basically, what makes you so much better than the rest of us? Ultimately, Korach's rebellion failed, and he and his followers were swallowed up into a crack in the earth's surface, along with everything that they owned. Throughout most of Jewish history, Korach has been viewed as sort of a villain, the most negative of figures whose dispute was viewed by the rabbis as the exact opposite of being for the sake of heaven, meaning his dispute lacked any enduring value for us. After all, if he was punished by God, then certainly his plea must have been invalid. But modern readers of Torah have begun to ask a harder question. What if Korach had a point? There's one piece of Korach's message that stands out to me above the rest as pointing to a positive reading. He says, when describing the community, Kol ha'edah kulam kedoshim, all of the community are holy. Not all of the community is holy. It's sort of an interesting framing. Rabbinic commentators take this to mean that he's not only citing the community whole as holy, but rather specifying that each member of the community is inherently holy. As medieval commentator Rashi says, "For they all heard the utterances on Sinai from the mouth of the Almighty." Korach, for all his insolence, was arguing for something radical, that every voice in the community deserved to be heard, not just the voice at the top. He was reaching, imperfectly, maybe even toward something like democracy. And yet, he was punished for it. Torah, like history, tends to be told from the perspective of those in power. Moses, God, later on the rabbis, they control the narrative. Korach's voice survives only because it was recorded as a warning to us. And yet, here we are, centuries later, perhaps finding some truth in it anyway. I bring this to us today on Juneteenth as we reckon with our nation's history of enslavement and freedom, because I believe it's important that we recognize that history, as we have been taught it, does not always contain the multitudes of possible truths within it. When we look to our history as a people, as Jews, as Americans, it's important that we try and uncover the voices who may not have been preserved and the perspectives that may not have been welcomed. In the history of the Jewish commentary, it's radical to see Korach as the good guy. Just like for many, dwelling on the history of slavery and the impact on our contemporary Black neighbors feels really uncomfortable. But if we don't reckon with where we came from, how can we begin to even understand where we're going? If the woman this morning doesn't consider the impact of her ancestors, how can she rectify any of their wrongdoing? If I don't acknowledge the harm my family caused in the Jim Crow South, How will I truly move forward with intention and purpose? And most of all, if we don't listen to the stories of our friends and neighbors who have been harmed directly by our hands or by our passivity, how can we truly claim to see the holiness in every member of our community? This morning at Dorsey Park, standing on land that the Overtown community is fighting to restore and sanctify, I felt the weight of that question more than ever, more than I would ever find in a classroom or in a history book. History is not abstract when you're standing upon it. On this Juneteenth, let us remember that all of our community are holy and that each of us has a voice that matters. Let us remember that as Jews and Americans, it is our job to seek out the full and sometimes uncomfortable truth of our history and to create spaces where new interpretations and voices can be heard. As we move into our 250th year, let us be the generation to reclaim the narratives of the past and to build the futures that ancestors like Dana Dorsey and so many others imagined but never got to see. Shabbat Shalom.